Cambridge Analytica. The secret story of how they stole your mind. Imagine if you could know exactly which button to press in a person's mind to make them vote for your candidate. Imagine if you could identify the voters most susceptible to propaganda, create personalized messages that exploit their deepest fears, and send them directly to their screens without them even realizing they're being manipulated. Imagine if you could do this not with hundreds or thousands of people, but with millions in real time during an election. You don't need to imagine it. It already happened, and it changed the course of world history. This is the story of Cambridge Analytica, the company that turned your Facebook data into weapons of mass manipulation, that helped elect presidents and decide referendums, and that, when discovered, revealed something much more terrifying than a simple privacy violation. It revealed that we live in an era where democracy can be hacked. The architects of chaos. Our story begins in London, in the elegant offices of a company with an innocuous name, SCL Group. Strategic Communication Laboratories sounded like just another public relations consultancy. But behind that corporate facade lay something much more sinister. A psychological warfare operation that had been experimenting for decades with mind manipulation techniques in third world countries. SCL wasn't new to the business of molding minds. For years they had worked for governments and militaries, perfecting methods to influence entire populations during conflicts and crises. They had learned to use fear, confusion, and disinformation as weapons as lethal as any bomb. Their specialty was what they called influence operations, changing what people think without them realizing their thinking is being changed. But in the early 2010s, the brains behind SCL realized something revolutionary. The same techniques they had used to destabilize countries in Africa and Asia could be perfectly applied to Western democracies. All they needed was access to massive data about citizens. And they knew exactly where to find it. The Pink Genius and his digital laboratory. Here enters one of the most fascinating characters in this story. Christopher Wiley. Imagine a 24-year-old genius with pink hair, striking tattoos, and a mind capable of seeing patterns where others only see chaos. Wiley didn't look like the typical political consultant, but he had something SCL desperately needed. He understood how to convert digital data into precise psychological profiles. Wiley had studied something called psychometrics, the science of measuring human personality. He had discovered that by analyzing a person's digital interactions, which pages they like, which photos they comment on, which articles they share, you could create a detailed map of their psychology. You didn't just know if they were extroverted or introverted. You could predict their fears, their insecurities, their emotional breaking points. But Wiley had a problem. He needed data. Millions and millions of detailed profiles of real users. And that's where Facebook entered the equation. The Facebook trick, when sharing became spying. In 2014, Facebook had a feature that today seems incredibly naive. When you gave an app permission to access your data, that app could also access the data of all your friends. It was like giving someone the key to your house. And that person also automatically getting the keys to all your neighbors' houses. Alexander Kogan, a Cambridge academic with both British and Russian connections, created an apparently innocent app called This Is Your Digital Life. It was a simple personality quiz that promised to reveal psychological traits in exchange for access to your Facebook profile. It seemed harmless. It paid users a few dollars to complete it. What could go wrong? Around 270,000 people installed the app. But thanks to Facebook's policy, those 270,000 people became a gateway to data from 87 million users. Every friend, every family member, every acquaintance of those initial users involuntarily became raw material for the largest psychological manipulation experiment in history. Kogan delivered all this data to Cambridge Analytica, flagrantly violating Facebook's terms of service. But by then it was too late. The data was out, copied, analyzed, and converted into psychological weapons. Digital alchemy, converting likes into slogans. With 87 million psychological profiles in their hands, Cambridge Analytica put their data scientists to work. What they did next was like digital alchemy. They took apparently innocuous likes, shares, and comments and transmuted them into an arsenal of political manipulation. They developed what they called psychographic micro-targeting. Instead of targeting voters based on traditional demographics, age, income, location, they could target them based on their psychology. They identified the persuadables, those people who might change their vote if they received the right message at the right time. Were you an anxious person worried about security? You received ads about crime and immigration designed to amplify your fears. Were you someone competitive who valued winning? They showed you polls suggesting your preferred candidate was losing and needed your help. Were you someone who felt left behind economically? They bombarded you with messages about how traditional politicians had betrayed you. Each message was a psychological bullet designed specifically for your mental profile. And the most terrifying part, it worked. Trump 2016. The American Laboratory. When Donald Trump decided to run for president in 2015, his campaign was considered a joke by the political establishment. He didn't have the traditional machinery. He didn't have the backing of established donors. He had no political experience. What he did have was something revolutionary. Cambridge Analytica. Steve Bannon, the political strategist who would become Trump's ideological brain, had been financing Cambridge Analytica through the multimillionaire Mercer family. Bannon saw in the company a unique opportunity to use digital psychological warfare to break the American political system from within. Cambridge Analytica identified approximately 13.5 million persuadable voters in key states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. These weren't regular Democratic or Republican voters. They were people who could vote either way depending on which psychological buttons were pressed. Trump's campaign spent more money on digital advertising than any campaign in American history up to that point. But it wasn't traditional advertising. It was thousands of personalized microads. each designed to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of small groups of voters. In Michigan, African American voters received ads designed to discourage them from voting, showing past statements by Hillary Clinton that might sound offensive to their community. In Pennsylvania, unemployed industrial workers received messages about how free trade had destroyed their jobs. In Wisconsin, rural voters saw content about how urban elites despised them. Each message was a carefully constructed lie, a half-truth designed to manipulate specific emotions. And it worked with surgical precision. Brexit, the dress rehearsal. But before conquering America, Cambridge Analytica had sharpened their techniques in another laboratory. The Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. This was where they really perfected the art of democratic manipulation. The Leave.eu campaign, led by Aaron Banks, spent millions on Cambridge Analytica services. The company identified that British voters most susceptible to pro-Brexit messages were those who felt economically insecure and culturally threatened. Cambridge Analytica created two main narratives. For older, more conservative voters, the message was about taking back control and protecting British sovereignty. For working-class voters, they focused on immigration and job competition. Each group received a different version of the truth about the European Union, carefully designed to resonate with their specific anxieties. The most perverse part was that both groups thought they were making an informed and autonomous decision. They didn't realize that their emotions had been mapped, analyzed, and exploited by algorithms. Brexit won by a surprisingly narrow margin. Cambridge Analytica had achieved something that seemed impossible. Convincing a country to abandon an economic union that had benefited it for decades, using nothing more than Facebook data and applied psychology. The whistleblower. When conscience awakened. Christopher Wiley had helped create this monster. But by 2016, he began to realize the magnitude of what he had unleashed. He saw how his personality algorithms were being used to sow division, hatred, and paranoia in entire societies. What had begun as a fascinating academic exercise had become an existential threat to democracy. Wiley became what in the espionage world is called a whistleblower. He began secretly documenting Cambridge Analytica's internal operations, gathering evidence of their methods, their clients, and their effects. In 2018, Wiley decided to break his silence. He approached The Guardian and the New York Times with a story that would sound like science fiction if it weren't completely real. He had internal documents, conversation recordings, evidence of data transfers, and first-hand testimony about how Cambridge Analytica had manipulated elections around the world. The revelation. When the world awakened. When Wiley's revelations were published in March 2018, it was as if a bomb had exploded in the heart of the technology industry. Suddenly, the general public learned that their Facebook data had not only been violated, but used to manipulate their own political decisions. Mark Zuckerberg was called to testify before the U.S. Congress. Facebook's stock plummeted. Governments around the world began investigations. Cambridge Analytica, facing global scrutiny, announced it would cease operations and declare bankruptcy. But the damage was already done. Elections had been influenced, referendums decided, democracies compromised. And most terrifying, Cambridge Analytica had proven it was possible. They had created the manual for hacking democracy in the digital age. Global tentacles. As investigations progressed, it was revealed that Cambridge Analytica had not been an isolated case. The company had operated in more than 200 elections worldwide. They had worked in Nigeria, Kenya, India, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, and dozens of other countries. In each case, the method was the same. Obtain massive data about voters, create detailed psychological profiles, identify emotional vulnerabilities, and then bombard specific groups with propaganda designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. In Kenya, they had helped incite ethnic violence to benefit their political client. In Nigeria, they had used disinformation techniques to influence presidential elections. In India, they had worked with the BJP party to amplify religious and caste divisions. Cambridge Analytica wasn't just a political consulting firm. It was a global psychological warfare organization that sold democratic manipulation services to the highest bidder. The silence of the accomplices. One of the most disturbing parts of this entire story is how mainstream media initially ignored or minimized the revelations. For months, the only people talking about Cambridge Analytica were academics, privacy activists, and independent media. Why? Because many of the same media outlets that should have been investigating Cambridge Analytica had financial and commercial connections with Facebook and other big tech companies. Their advertising revenue depended on the same platforms that had facilitated the manipulation. Furthermore, admitting the magnitude of what Cambridge Analytica had achieved meant admitting that the elections they had covered, the results they had analyzed, the trends they had reported, might have been the product of artificial manipulation. It was easier to minimize the story than face the implications. Facebook, the unwitting accomplice or not? Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook insisted they had been victims of Cambridge Analytica, that the company had violated their terms of service and obtained data fraudulently. But this narrative had giant holes. Facebook had known since 2015 that Cambridge Analytica had illegally obtained user data. Instead of publicly reporting the violation or notifying affected users, Facebook simply asked Cambridge Analytica to delete the data and certify they had eliminated it. It was like asking a thief to return what was stolen based solely on their word. Even more disturbing, Facebook's policies that had allowed massive data extraction weren't a bug, they were a feature. Facebook had deliberately designed its platform to maximize data collection, because that data was exactly what it sold to advertisers. The uncomfortable truth was that Facebook's business model depended on mass surveillance and psychological manipulation. Cambridge Analytica had simply taken these techniques to their logical conclusion. The toxic legacy. Although Cambridge Analytica officially closed in 2018, its legacy continued. The same executives founded new companies with different names, but identical methodologies. The techniques they had developed spread throughout the political consulting industry. More importantly, Cambridge Analytica had demonstrated the fundamental vulnerability of digital democracies. They had shown that it was possible to manipulate elections not through traditional fraud, stuffing ballot boxes or falsifying votes, but through sophisticated psychological manipulation of the voters themselves. In the digital age, you don't need to steal votes. You can manufacture opinions. You don't need to censor information. You can flood the information space with personalized disinformation. You don't need to ban democracy. You can empty it of meaning from within. The new reality. Today, 5 years after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we live in a fundamentally changed world. Every major election since 2016 has been suspect of digital manipulation. Every unexpected political result generates questions about what algorithms might have influenced it. The techniques Cambridge Analytica pioneered are now routinely used by political campaigns, corporations, and governments worldwide. The difference is that now they're more sophisticated, more hidden, and harder to detect. The data feeding these operations no longer comes just from Facebook. It comes from Google, Amazon, TikTok, fitness apps, streaming services, virtual assistants, and thousands of other sources that monitor every aspect of our digital lives. The future of manipulation. What Cambridge Analytica did in 2016 will seem primitive compared to what's possible today. Artificial intelligence has advanced to the point where it can generate personalized content in real time, create convincing deepfakes, and maintain conversations indistinguishable from human ones. Imagine a future version of Cambridge Analytica that doesn't just analyze your social media data, but also monitors your sleep patterns through your smartwatch, analyzes your health searches, tracks your physical movements, listens to your conversations through smart devices, and uses all that information to create psychological profiles, so detailed they can predict your behavior with near-perfect accuracy. Then imagine this information being used to create completely personalized realities for each individual, where each person lives in their own information bubble designed specifically to influence their political, economic, and social decisions. This isn't science fiction. This is where we're headed if we don't take dramatic measures to protect our mental autonomy in the digital age. The necessary resistance. The Cambridge Analytica story isn't just about a corrupt company or a privacy scandal. It's about a fundamental threat to the very idea of democracy and free will in the 21st century. But it's also a story about resistance. Christopher Wiley risked his career and personal safety to expose the truth. Investigative journalists worked for months to document and verify an incredibly complex story. Privacy activists had been warning about these risks for years. Their example shows us that digital manipulation isn't inevitable. It's a choice we make as a society. We can choose technologies that respect our mental autonomy. We can demand transparency in the algorithms that influence our decisions. We can build political systems more resistant to manipulation. The awakening. In the end, Cambridge Analytica gave us something invaluable. It woke us up. It showed us that we lived in a matrix of digital manipulation we didn't know existed. It revealed that our democracies were much more fragile than we thought, but also that our consciousness and resistance were much more powerful than the manipulators expected. The question now isn't whether we can return to the digital innocence of before 2016. We can't. The question is whether we'll use this knowledge to build a future where technology serves humanity, or whether we'll allow humanity to be reduced to data to be manipulated by machines. Cambridge Analytica stole more than Facebook data. They stole the illusion that our thoughts are completely our own. But in doing so, they also gave us the opportunity to reclaim our mental autonomy more consciously and determinately than ever before in human history. The war for our minds is far from over. But thanks to whistleblowers like Christopher Wiley, at least now we know we're at war.